The church bells of Florence clang through the air on Sunday, April 26, 1478. The sound echoed off the colorful buildings, bringing the city to life. Lorenzo de Medici, the powerful and charismatic leader of the Medici family, was making his way through the bustling streets. He was surrounded by his closest friends, all of them heading towards the Grand Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. Lorenzo, at 29, was a man of many talents. He was a skilled musician, an accomplished poet, and a generous patron of the arts. Despite his wealth and power, he dressed simply, preferring to blend in with the people of Florence. His broad nose and protruding jaw made him easy to recognize, but it was his magnetic personality that truly set him apart. As they approached the cathedral, Lorenzo's younger brother, Giuliano, was struggling to keep up. He was in pain from a bout of sciatica, a condition that made walking difficult. Francesco de Pazzi, a close friend of the Medici family, noticed Giuliano's discomfort and offered to help. He put a friendly arm around Giuliano's shoulder, trying to ease his pain. But something about Francesco's manner seemed off, and Giuliano couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The crowd was thick as they entered the cathedral. The vast space was filled with the sounds of the choir and the scent of incense. Lorenzo and his friends made their way to the front, where they stood near the high altar. Giuliano, still limping, decided to stay by the door with Francesco and another friend, Bernardo Bandini. The service began, and the voices of the choir rose in a beautiful harmony. As the priest prepared to celebrate High Mass, the sacristy bell rang softly. In that moment, chaos erupted. Bernardo Bandini, who had been standing by the door, suddenly pulled out a dagger. With a swift, brutal motion, he stabbed Giuliano in the head. Blood splattered across the stone floor as Giuliano crumpled to the ground. Francesco de Pazzi, driven by a frenzied rage, began stabbing at Giuliano's body, slashing wildly. In his frenzy, Francesco even cut his own thigh, but he didn't seem to notice. At the high altar, two priests who had been standing behind Lorenzo also made their move. One of them grabbed Lorenzo by the shoulder, preparing to strike. But Lorenzo, quick on his feet, spun around and parried the blow. The tip of the dagger sliced his neck, but it was only a surface wound. Lorenzo ripped off his cloak, using it as a makeshift shield, and drew his sword. His friends quickly formed a protective circle around him. Lorenzo leaped over the altar rail and sprinted towards the sacristy door. The two priests pursued him, but his friends fought them off, creating a barrier. Bernardo Bandini, seeing Lorenzo's escape, tried to cut him off. But Francesco Nori, one of Lorenzo's loyal friends, threw himself in the way and was killed instantly. Lorenzo and his remaining friends managed to reach the sacristy and slam the heavy bronze doors shut. Inside, Lorenzo pressed his hand to his neck, feeling the blood flow. His friend Antonio Ridolfi, worried about the possibility of poison, kissed the wound and spat out the blood. The sounds of chaos outside the door were deafening, but Lorenzo's mind was focused on one thing: his brother. Giuliano, is he safe? Lorenzo asked, his voice trembling. His friends exchanged worried glances, but said nothing. Meanwhile, the other part of the plot was unfolding in the Palazzo della Signoria, the city's government building. Archbishop Salviati, one of the conspirators, had entered the building with a group of armed men disguised as his retinue. He claimed to have an important message from Pope Sixtus IV for the Gonfaloniere, the city's ruler. As the Gonfaloniere, Cesare Petrucci, was about to receive the archbishop, he noticed something was wrong. The archbishop's hand was shaking, and his voice was shaky. When the Gonfaloniere called for the guards, Salviati fled, and his men burst into the building. But the Gonfaloniere and his colleagues managed to barricade themselves in the tower, and began ringing the emergency bell. The sound of the bell spread panic through the city. People began to gather in the Piazza della Signoria, the main square. Jacopo de Pazzi, one of the leaders of the conspiracy, appeared with a group of armed men, shouting, "Popolo e Liberia," the people and freedom, but the crowd was suspicious and didn't join in. Instead, they began to turn against the conspirators. Medici supporters, hearing the alarm, rushed to the square. They stormed the Palazzo della Signoria, killing the conspirators and their mercenary followers. The severed heads of the mercenaries were carried on pikes, causing the crowd to erupt into a frenzy of violence. Lorenzo, bandaged and bloodied, appeared on the balcony of the Palazzo Medici. He addressed the crowd, telling them that the conspiracy had failed and that he was alive, though his brother Giuliano was dead. But the crowd, now thirsty for revenge, was not satisfied. They began to hunt down anyone associated with the Pazzi family, exacting brutal vengeance. The streets of Florence became a scene of chaos and bloodshed. The bodies of the conspirators, including Francesco de Pazzi and Archbishop Salviati, were hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. The crowd cheered and jeered, their anger and fear fueling a wave of violence that swept through the city. In the days that followed, the city was in turmoil. The failed Pazzi conspiracy had left a deep scar on Florence, and the Medici family's enemies were determined to strike back. Pope Sixtus IV, who had backed the conspirators, declared war on Florence, excommunicating Lorenzo and placing the city under an interdict. As the sun set over Florence, the city was a shadow of its former self, the air thick with the scent of blood and the sounds of weeping. But the Medici family, led by the resilient Lorenzo, would not go down without a fight. The Medici family, one of the most influential and powerful dynasties in Renaissance Florence, has a storied past that begins with a legendary knight named Averardo. According to Medici family lore, Averardo fought for Charlemagne during his conquest of Lombardy in the 8th century. One day, while traveling through the Mugello Valley, Averardo heard about a giant terrorizing the region. He bravely faced the giant, dodged the iron balls from the giant's mace, and eventually slew the monster. Charlemagne was so impressed that he allowed Averardo to use his dented shield as his personal emblem. This dented shield, with its red balls on a gold background, became the famous Medici coat of arms. However, historical evidence suggests a different origin for the Medici insignia. Some believe the red balls represent coins, reflecting the family's early business in money changing. This makes more sense than the idea that they were medicinal pills, which didn't become common until much later. Averardo settled in the Mugello Valley, a beautiful region with vineyards and olive groves, and the Medici family retained strong ties to this area. Around the turn of the 13th century, the Medici moved to Florence, joining many other families seeking better opportunities in the growing city. Florence's population exploded during this period, increasing fivefold to over 50,000, making it larger than Rome or London. The Medici settled in the San Lorenzo neighborhood, near the ancient church of San Lorenzo. This area became the heart of the Medici's influence. The Mercato Vecchio, the city's main market, was just a short walk away. In the early morning, the market buzzed with activity as farmers brought their goods, and merchants sold a variety of products, from bright fabrics to fresh produce and live animals. The market was a vibrant hub of commerce and social life, where people from all walks of life gathered. The first Medici mentioned in Florence's records is Carissimo, who appeared in a legal document in 1201. The family became money changers and gradually grew in wealth and influence. By the end of the 13th century, they were one of the better-known families in Florence, though not yet among the most powerful. Florence's political system was unique. It was an independent republic governed by a 9-man council called the Signoria, with the Gonfaloniere as the chief. The Gonfaloniere and the Signoria were chosen by lottery from the guilds, but these lotteries were often fixed. In 1296, Ardingo de Medici became the first Medici to serve as Gonfaloniere, followed by Guccio de Medici in 1299 and Averardo de Medici in 1314. These appointments showed that the Medici were gaining political clout. Florence's wealth grew rapidly in the 13th century, largely due to the banking industry. Italian cities, especially Florence, became major financial centers. Banks facilitated international trade, and merchant bankers accumulated vast assets, which they lent out at interest. Despite the church's ban on usury, banks found ways to justify their practices, such as charging for risk rather than interest. Siena, Florence's rival, was the leading banking center until the Bonsignori family's bankruptcy in 1298. This collapse gave Florence the opportunity to take over the banking trade. By the early 14th century, 3 powerful Florentine families, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, and the Acciaiuoli dominated banking across Europe. Their success was partly due to the trustworthiness of Florentine bankers and the stability of the florin. a gold coin issued by Florence in 1252. The florin's consistent value made it a standard currency throughout Europe. However, the Florentine banks made a critical mistake by lending large sums to European monarchs, who often failed to repay their debts. In 1340, an economic depression hit Europe, and kings like Edward III of England refused to pay their loans. This led to the bankruptcy of the Bardi, Peruzzi, and Acciaiuoli banks in quick succession. Despite these setbacks, the Medici family continued to rise. Their early business in money changing laid the foundation for their later banking and political success. The Medici's story is one of ambition, resilience, and the strategic use of wealth to gain power and influence in Renaissance Florence. In the early 1300s, Florence was a bustling city, full of creativity and new ideas. Despite the political chaos, it saw a cultural golden age thanks to three of Italy's greatest writers, Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch. These writers broke away from the tradition of writing in Latin, the language of the church, and instead chose to write in Tuscan, the local dialect. This helped establish Tuscan as the standard form of Italian, and brought literature to more people outside the church. Petrarch spent his time looking for ancient classical manuscripts in monasteries, while Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of stories that were often humorous and sometimes even considered scandalous, reflecting real life rather than the idealized world the church wanted people to believe in. Artists like Giotto and Pisano also brought a new human touch to their work, making their figures look more real and emotional, moving away from the stiff and formal art of the Middle Ages. This new focus on human experience and realism set the stage for the Renaissance, but before it could fully bloom, a terrible disaster struck: the Black Death. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, brought by ships from the Black Sea. Over the next 4 years, it killed about 1/3 of Europe's population. In cities where sanitation was poor and people lived close together, the situation was even worse. Families suspected of having the plague were sometimes sealed in their homes to die. Many people fled to the countryside, and those who stayed in the city often didn't survive. The plague brought a wave of fear and superstition, but it also marked the beginning of the end for the rigid social structure of medieval Europe. Meanwhile, the Medici family in Florence was growing. They were not a single family, but more like a clan, with different branches that sometimes competed with each other. After the bankruptcy of 3 leading Florentine banking families, the Medici saw an opportunity and started their own small banking businesses. They dealt with foreign currency exchange, small deposits, and loans to wool traders and weavers. 2 of these Medici enterprises survived the economic crisis caused by the Black Death, giving the Medici a strong foundation in Florence. One of the most ambitious Medici, Giovanni de Medici, tried to become a military leader in 1343 by leading a war against the city of Lucca. The campaign was a disaster, and Giovanni was executed when he returned to Florence. After this, the Medici stuck to civil affairs, but even then, things could be dangerous. In 1378, Silvestro de Medici became the Gonfaloniere, a high-ranking official in Florence. During his term, a revolt broke out among the wool workers, known as the Ciompi. They demanded the right to form their own guilds and have a say in the city's government. Silvestro, who was sympathetic to the Ciompi, secretly opened the prisons, which turned a peaceful protest into a riot. The rioters looted and burned the homes of the wealthy, and Silvestro and the other officials had to barricade themselves in the Palazzo della Signoria for safety. The riot lasted for 2 years, and when it ended, Silvestro was exiled, which was a severe blow to the Medici family. After Silvestro's exile, Viri de Medici took over the family business. He focused on building the business, opening offices in Rome and Venice, and trading through the port of Pisa. Viri was successful, and even though he wasn't interested in politics, he had a chance to become a powerful figure in Florence. However, he chose to stay out of politics, which was a wise decision given the dangerous political climate. In 1393, another revolt broke out, this time by the Popolo Magro, the poorest and most desperate people in the city. They remembered how the Medici had supported them in the past, and asked Viri to lead them. Viri cleverly led the mob to the Signoria, and made a speech that satisfied everyone. The revolt ended without any reprisals, but the stress of the event was too much for Viri, and he died later that year. The Medici family's fortunes then passed to Giovanni di Pazzi de Medici, a man from the Cafagolo branch of the family. Giovanni was born in 1360 and was just a teenager during the Ciampi revolt. He had a secret sympathy for the poor, but the political climate was not favorable for such sympathies. The powerful families in Florence, like the Albizzi, Caponi, and Azzano, formed an oligarchy that ruled the city. Giovanni's uncle Viri sent him to work in the Rome branch of the family bank, where he quickly showed his talent for business. In 1385, he married Piccardo Buri, who brought a large dowry that he used to invest in his own projects. When Viri retired in the early 1390s, Giovanni took over the Rome branch and eventually established a head office in Florence on October 1, 1397. This marked the beginning of the Medici Bank. The bank's initial capital was 10,000 florins, with Giovanni contributing 5,500 florins. The bank made a 10% profit in its first year, and Giovanni used some of the profits to buy farmland near his hometown, diversifying his investments. The Medici Bank's success was just the beginning of the family's rise to power, but it was built on a foundation of careful planning and hard work. Florence was a city of opportunity, and the Medici were ready to seize it. In the bustling city of Florence during the early 1400s, the Medici Bank was not just a place where money changed hands. It was a powerhouse that shaped the economic and political landscape of Italy and beyond. Giovanni di Pazzi, the founder of the Medici Bank, was a man of cautious wisdom, but his decisions would have a profound impact on the future of his family and the city of Florence. Giovanni's bank started small, with just a handful of employees and a single room for operations. But even in its early days, the Medici Bank showed signs of the success to come. In 1402, Giovanni decided to invest 3,000 florins in a cloth-producing workshop. This was a strategic move, as the wool industry was a major part of Florence's economy, and the Medici family had already established themselves in this sector. The same year, the bank opened an office in Venice, managed by Neri Tornaquinci. Venice was a crucial hub for trade with the East, and this move allowed the Medici Bank to benefit from the profitable commerce that surrounded the Venetian monopoly. The bank's expansion continued with the opening of sub-offices in Naples and Gaeta, but Giovanni remained cautious. He believed in consolidating his gains rather than risking rapid growth. This conservative approach was a hallmark of the Medici family, and it would serve them well in the years to come. As the bank's profits grew, Giovanni began to invest in land, buying properties in the Mugello and the Tuscan hills. He also started acquiring properties within Florence, laying the foundation for the family's wealth and influence. Giovanni's influence extended beyond banking. In 1401, he served on a committee that judged an international competition to create new bronze doors for the baptistry. This was the first time a Medici was involved in artistic patronage, though the city itself was the actual patron. The artist chosen for the commission was Lorenzo de Medici, a young sculptor who would later become one of the founders of Renaissance art. This event marked the beginning of the Medici family's role in fostering the artistic and cultural renaissance that would define Florence. Despite his growing wealth and influence, Giovanni remained a man of shrewd judgment and practical wisdom. A portrait by Bronzino, painted long after Giovanni's death, depicts him as a man with a clear, unwavering stare and a forehead lined with the worries of a banker. The portrait suggests a blend of peasant earthiness and calculating intelligence, traits that were essential to his success. In 1402, Giovanni became the prior of the Florentine Arte del Cambio, the guild of bankers and money changers, and held a seat on the ruling signoria. This position gave him a voice in the city's governance, but the bank itself was still a modest operation. Most banks of the time were small, with a single room divided by a counter where the clerks and bookkeepers worked. The Medici Bank had only 17 employees, but they were spread across several cities, including Florence, Rome, Venice, Naples, and Gaeta. Banking in the early 1400s was a risky business, and even Giovanni, with his cautious nature, faced challenges. One such challenge came from Neri Tornaquinci, the manager of the Venice office. Neri was explicitly forbidden from doing business with the Germans, who were known for their devious business practices. However, he took a risk and loaned money to some German traders. When the Germans disappeared with the money, Neri was left with a large discrepancy in his accounts. In a panic, he borrowed more money to cover the debt. but the high interest rates made it impossible to balance the books. Giovanni discovered the fraud, dismissed Neri, and sued him for the missing money. Neri sold everything he had but still couldn't pay the debt, so he fled north to Poland, where he managed to recover some of the money, but chose to start a new life instead of returning it. Giovanni's cautious nature did not always protect him from risky decisions. One of his most significant gambles involved Baldassare Casa, a former pirate and law student who had bought his way into the church. In 1402, Baldassare needed 10,000 ducats to buy a cardinal's hat, and Giovanni loaned him the money. Baldassare's reputation was questionable, and he was known for his extravagant lifestyle, but Giovanni saw an opportunity. If Baldassare became pope, the Medici Bank could handle the financial affairs of the Curia, which would make them one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. Giovanni's gamble paid off in 1410 when Baldassare was elected Pope John XXIII. The Medici Bank took over the handling of the Curia's finances, a position that brought enormous profits. The papal revenues came from a vast network of sees throughout Europe, the sale of holy relics, and the trade in indulgences. The sums involved were enormous, and the bank's commission on these transactions was a significant source of income. The Rome branch of the Medici Bank became particularly profitable, providing over half of the bank's total profits. It dealt with the financial affairs of cardinals, prelates, and other officials who attended the court of Rome. Despite the high income of these officials, many were frequently overdrawn, and the bank often had to lend them money. Despite these loans, the Rome branch yielded a 30% return on investment, making it the most lucrative part of the bank. However, the Medici Bank's success was not without its challenges. The era of the Great Schism, when there were three rival claimants to the papal throne, created political and financial instability. King Ladislas of Naples, who backed one of the rival popes, launched a military campaign against the Papal States. Pope John XXIII was forced to sign a humiliating treaty and pay a large sum of money. Giovanni, despite his caution, decided to loan the Pope 95,000 florins to cover the payment. This was a significant risk, but Giovanni saw it as a necessary investment to protect his position. To keep a close watch on this investment, Giovanni sent his eldest son, Cosimo, to accompany Pope John XXIII to the Council of Constance in 1414. The council was called by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund to resolve the Great Schism. Cosimo, who was 25 at the time, showed great promise as a banker, and Giovanni's decision to send him on this important mission was a sign of his trust in his son's abilities. The trip to Constance would be a turning point for Cosimo and the Medici family. It would test their skills, their loyalty, and their ability to navigate the complex world of high finance and politics. As the Medici Bank continued to grow and prosper, it would become a symbol of the family's influence and the beginning of their legendary patronage of the arts and culture that would define the Renaissance. Giovanni di Bix, I had always been a shrewd and cautious man, but sometimes even the most careful plans require a bold move. In 1418, after 3 long years in a grim prison in Heidelberg, Baldassare Casa, the deposed Pope John XXIII, was finally set free. Despite his fall from grace, Baldassare still held a certain gravitas, and Giovanni saw an opportunity. He welcomed Baldassare into his home in Florence, a gesture that transformed the Medici family's social standing overnight. Even though Baldassare was no longer the Pope, Giovanni's act of hospitality showed the world that the Medici were a family of unwavering loyalty and trustworthiness. This move was more than just a show of kindness. Giovanni had a bigger plan in mind. He knew that the new Pope, Martin V, was living in Florence because Rome was under the control of Queen Joanna of Naples. Giovanni saw a chance to become the new Pope's banker, a position that would solidify the Medici Bank's reputation and influence across Europe. He had a condition for Baldassare's release. The former Pope must publicly reconcile with Martin V. This reconciliation happened, and Martin V was pleased. As a token of his gratitude, Martin V appointed Baldassare as the Cardinal Bishop of Tusculum. Giovanni, however, was not rewarded immediately. The Pope was still wary of the Medici, and was particularly upset about a jewel-encrusted mitre that John XXIII had given Giovanni before his escape from Constance. The Pope claimed it as papal property, but the matter remained unresolved. In 1420, Pope Martin V moved to Rome, and to Giovanni's disappointment, he chose the Spini family as his bankers. The Spini were a socially superior family, and this decision was a blow to the Medici's ambitions. But Giovanni did not give up. He continued to build his network and cultivate relationships, especially with influential figures like Niccolò di Lozano, who had helped persuade Baldassare to reconcile with the Pope. The political landscape of Florence was changing. The old ruling oligarchy was losing its grip, and the Medici family's reputation as supporters of the common people, or Piagnoni, was growing. In 1421, Giovanni was elected Gonfaloniere, the highest office in Florence. Despite objections from Niccolò da Lozano, who feared Giovanni's ambition and cleverness, the people of Florence recognized his contributions and leadership. This election marked the beginning of the Medici family's political influence, which would eventually lead to their control of Florence for more than 3 centuries. Tragedy struck in 1422, when Baldassare Casa died. True to his word, he named the Medici as executors of his will. Giovanni inherited a holy relic, a finger of John the Baptist, and was tasked with building Baldassare's tomb in the baptistery of Florence. The tomb, designed by the renowned sculptor Donatello and architect Michelozzo, was one of the earliest examples of the new Renaissance style. However, the inscription, John the 23rd, formerly Pope, on the tomb angered Pope Martin V, who considered John the 23rd an antipope. This caused tension between the Medici and the papacy, but Giovanni's influence continued to grow. In 1424, the Spini family went bankrupt, leaving Pope Martin V without a banker. Giovanni saw his chance and quickly stepped in. The Medici Bank was once again granted the license to coin money, and the Rome branch began to flourish. The secret accounts in the Libro Segreto, which included large deposits from high-ranking church officials, further cemented the Medici Bank's position as a trusted financial institution. Giovanni di Bixi's legacy was not just about wealth and influence. It was about the foundation he laid for his family's future. His son, Cosimo de Medici, would go on to build upon this foundation, transforming the Medici into one of the most powerful and influential families in European history. Giovanni's careful planning, bold moves, and unwavering loyalty had set the stage for the Medici to rule Florence and shape the cultural and political landscape of the Renaissance.